The young man criticized Traoré's speech and was stunned when he realized. He just interrupted the president. "You're talking like a country farmer." The National Technical University of Burkina Faso, one of the most prestigious and dynamic schools in the capital, held a students and young leaders exchange event this afternoon in the main auditorium. Under the warm late-afternoon sun streaming through the old window panes, rows of seats gradually filled up with students in neat uniforms, holding notebooks, their eyes fixed on the stage. The event didn't announce the main speaker's name, just a faint line on the poster. "A special guest to make you listen with your ears, think with your heart, not just your eyes." Many students were skeptical, some were eager, while others considered it just another attendance check. Among the crowd, one stood out, Eli Dembele, a final-year communications student. Tall, with a bright face, dressed sharply, a national debate champion and admired by many of his peers as a symbol of the new generation's critics. Eli sat in the second row, ready with his Mont Blanc pen, and an expression that couldn't hide his confidence. He once said, "To know who a leader is, just listen to them speak. If they make me fall asleep in 3 minutes, then they're not worthy." At 2:10 p.m., a man entered the auditorium from the side door. He wore a plain white shirt, gray pants, soft-soled shoes, and had neatly cut hair. No badge, no insignia. No one recognized him. He sat in the last row, quiet as a mere assistant. No one knew he was President Ibrahim Traoré. He came incognito without prior notice, no bodyguards, no media. His only purpose: "I want to hear what students think when they believe I'm just nobody." The moderator stepped onto the podium. "Before we start the main discussion, I invite any student who would like to share their thoughts on social responsibility to raise their hand and speak." A brief silence. Then, the man in the white shirt from the last row raised his hand. The entire auditorium was momentarily surprised. He wasn't in uniform. He didn't have a student ID. The moderator nodded and gestured for him to come up to the stage. He stepped forward, holding the microphone with both hands, and spoke slowly. "I am not a student here. But I was once a young man sitting in the back row, dreaming of saying something useful for the next generation." His voice wasn't loud. There was no grandeur in his words. His language was plain, slightly out of sync with the modern atmosphere of the auditorium. "I believe that a country doesn't change by laws, but by each person who stands up when they see the smallest injustice. Not waiting until they hold a title, but starting when no one is listening." A few students lowered their heads to take notes. Others rolled their eyes. Eli furrowed his brow. He whispered to his friend beside him, "Why does this sound like a middle school speech?" The man continued, "When I was 20, I was afraid to speak, because I was afraid of being laughed at. But then I realized if you're too scared to speak the truth just because of the fear of being laughed at, then we're living by other people's fears, not our own." Eli raised his hand. The moderator nodded and signaled for him to speak. Eli stood up, his voice loud and clear. "Sorry, I don't know which organization you represent, but I think our generation doesn't need to hear personal countryside stories like that anymore." The whole auditorium went silent. "We need system thinking, we need solutions, we need direction, not moral lessons like just be good and everything will be fine." A few students sitting behind him muttered under their breath. The man in the white shirt just nodded. "Thank you for speaking honestly." He didn't argue. He wasn't angry. He simply clasped his hands, stepped down from the stage, and handed the microphone back. No one knew how to react. 10 minutes later, the university president, Professor Yusuf Sawadogo, appeared from the main door. He quickly walked to the podium, surveyed the room, and spoke in a formal tone. "I apologize for being late, and I'd like to officially introduce to all the students the person who just spoke earlier is President Ibrahim Traoré." The silence in the auditorium was like someone had sucked out all the oxygen. All eyes turned toward the back row. Eli stood frozen, his face pale. His hands, which had once confidently risen like sharp arrows, now trembled, unsure where to place them. Traoré stood up, loosened the button on his collar, and stepped back onto the stage, this time under a completely different gaze. He looked at Eli. No blame, no sarcasm. He only smiled, I'm very impressed by your confidence. So I invite you to come up here, stand beside me. And if you were me, what would you say that would make others not want to interrupt you? If you were in this position, what would you say? When Traoré extended his hand to invite him, Eli couldn't believe his ears. The entire auditorium was silent. Some students sneaked their phones up to record. Others turned to look at Eli, the once idol of the new generation's critics, now pale-faced with dry lips, not knowing whether to go up or stay seated. But no one laughed, no one shouted. Because on that stage, the president wasn't trying to expose anyone. He was inviting, not forcing. He was offering, not defeating. It felt like handing over a rare opportunity. Try standing in the position you just criticized and say what you think you should say. Eli stood up, slowly, his hands trembling slightly, his face a mix of embarrassment and confusion. He didn't look like someone preparing to critique. He looked like someone about to reflect on themselves for the first time. Traoré handed him the microphone and stayed on stage. Eli stood there, taking a few seconds to gather his breath. "Ladies and gentlemen, and Mr. President," the room murmured. A few shushes echoed as the audience began to focus again. Eli swallowed hard and continued. "Earlier, I interrupted you. Because I thought a national leader should say something grander, more strategic." He paused, looking down at the front row where the professors sat in silence. "But when I heard your question, if you were standing here, what would you say that would make others not want to interrupt you?" I suddenly understood. Perhaps what I lacked wasn't words, but listening. He turned to Traoré. "You didn't speak in a complicated way. You spoke in the language of someone who has truly lived. And I only know how to speak in the language of competition." Traoré nodded gently. He moved closer and took the microphone back. "Thank you, Eli. No sarcasm, no contempt. Dear students, when I was a student, I stood in front of a village classroom. I spoke very well because I had memorized a speech. But my teacher didn't clap. She just said, 'You can memorize 100 speeches, but if you don't live by what you say, then you're just repeating someone else's life.'" He looked around the auditorium, then at Eli. "Eli, you have talent. You speak better than I do. And if you dared to stand up today, then you also have courage. You just need a little more. The courage to realize that you've been unkind to someone you didn't fully understand." Eli lowered his head. The entire auditorium was still. No jeers, no whispers, only silence. Like when you unexpectedly see yourself in someone else's words. After a few minutes, Traoré broke the silence with a light smile. "Today I didn't come here to teach. I came here to learn. And I've learned from Eli that young people dare to speak, but they also need to dare to listen to their own words." He glanced at the back rows. "And if one day Eli becomes a leader, I believe he'll remember this feeling. The feeling of being interrupted, not because he was wrong, but because others didn't have the patience to understand. And when that happens, Eli won't interrupt anyone again." The applause rang out. Not loud, not performative, but it echoed, as though the whole room was breathing in unison, a breath of gratitude for witnessing a lesson that no syllabus could teach. At the end of the event, Traoré left the stage before the ceremony concluded. He didn't sign anything. He didn't take selfies. He didn't give a long speech. He just walked past Eli, placed a hand on his shoulder, and whispered, "People will remember your speech today. Not because you were right, but because you dared to admit you were wrong, while you still had a chance to correct it. And that is true leadership." Eli stood still for 5 minutes after Traoré left, his hand still holding the open notebook. But today's page no longer held theories. It only had one line written in blue ink: "I've learned how to speak. Today I've learned how to stay silent at the right moment." From an interrupted speech to a lifetime of reflection. The next day, the name Eli Dembele shot straight to the top of social media searches in Burkina Faso. Not because of an excellent speech, not because of a victory, but because of a 32-second clip filmed on a shaky phone with the following content, Eli. We don't need rural village stories. Host, sorry, do you know who is speaking right now? The principal steps up announcing, that's the president. Eli froze, his face pale. The clip went viral. In the comment section, teaching that arrogant guy a lesson, interrupting the president seriously. Knowledge doesn't come with awareness. In less than a day, Eli received more than 300 messages, from friends, acquaintances, even people he'd never met. Half of them were criticisms. The other half was a chilling silence from those who had once praised him. That evening, Eli didn't leave his room. He stared at the mirror, his finger still resting on the trackpad, hesitating between deleting his social media account or writing an apology. But then, he chose to do nothing. Not because of pride, but because, for the first time in his life, Eli felt he wasn't skilled enough to justify himself. No argument could save the eye that interrupted someone just because the voice didn't suit him. The next morning, Eli received an email from the president's office. No red subject line, no official seal, just a simple invitation. We invite you, Eli Dembele, to the National Youth Office for a private 15-minute dialogue with President Traoré. No press, no filming. Eli read it over and over again. His heart raced. He didn't understand why he was being called, even less, why no one else from the hundreds of students that day was invited. That afternoon, Eli wore a white shirt, the one his mother had ironed carefully before every exam. He arrived right on time. No security fences, no ceremonies, just a small room, a table, 2 chairs. Traoré was already sitting. No suit, no tie, just the same old shirt, the one he wore that day. Hello, Eli. Thank you for coming. Eli whispered. I didn't expect... You don't need to say anything. Traoré gently interrupted, but not harshly. Today I didn't invite you here to hear an apology. Eli looked up, his eyes wide. Traoré continued. I invited you because I see in you a real struggle. Not regret for being caught, but the pain of someone who once thought they were right, only to learn how to stand in humility. Eli fell silent. That phrase stripped Eli bare. Traoré looked directly into his eyes. I was once Eli. I used to criticize others for not speaking like me. I thought I was smart because I spoke louder than everyone. But then I learned it's not the words that make us great. It's the moments when we know how to stay silent. Eli swallowed hard. Traoré took out a small notebook and pushed it toward Eli. This is my notebook, from when I was a military student. Inside, there are hundreds of quotes I once learned, but the first one is from a woman who sold bread. Don't speak unless you've lived it. Eli opened the notebook. The handwriting was crooked, and some parts were blurred by water. Eli gripped the notebook tightly. I don't know what to say to... You don't need to say anything. Traoré smiled. You just need to live differently starting today. When someone stands up to speak, even if they speak poorly, think that they might be me on that day. And instead of interrupting, open your heart. When Eli left the room, he didn't feel honored. He only felt light. Light as if the heavy burden of judgment on him had been lifted. He opened his phone and posted a short status. I once thought leadership meant speaking like a politician. Today I learned that leadership sometimes just means knowing how to listen to someone who's been looked down upon, and knowing how to make that person no longer be looked down upon. The person who can change themselves is not the president, but the one I once looked down on. 2 weeks after his meeting with President Ibrahim Traoré, Eli still hadn't dared to return to the lecture hall. Not because he was afraid, but because he was taking time to reflect on himself. He reread old speeches, watched old clips of himself speaking, where his voice was loud, his gaze confident, and his words sharp. But the more he watched, the more Eli realized. He used to speak to win, not to connect. He made the whole auditorium clap, but no one remembered what he said, because throughout all of it, he had never truly listened to anyone. One late afternoon, Eli entered a small tea shop behind the old market, a place he used to visit when he was a first-year student. There was no sign, just a small wooden table, a few plastic chairs, and an elderly woman, over 70, always smiling, even though she was blind in one eye. Eli ordered a ginger tea, while sipping a middle-aged man sitting at the adjacent table turned to him and nodded hello. The face looked somewhat familiar. The man asked, "You're Eli?" "Right. You did a speech at the technical university, didn't you?" Eli nodded a bit, surprised. "I'm teacher Ndiaye, a former teaching assistant. You probably don't remember me. I once signed up to speak at a student seminar, but when I had barely spoken 3 sentences, you raised your hand and said, 'I think the speaker should make room for someone with more expertise.'" Eli froze. He remembered now. It was during his sophomore seminar. A man wearing an old shirt, his hair graying, speaking in a rural accent. Eli had thought he was ruining the atmosphere. He had interrupted him, in front of hundreds of people. And now, here he was, sitting next to him, smiling, as if nothing had happened.